Welcome everyone to this, to our virtual Young Israel and to our third annual Margot Jeremias Memorial Kristallnacht Commemoration Lecture. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of myself, the Young Israel, the Loew family. I want to just from the outset thank Voices of Hope for their partnership and helping man some of the technical sides of Zoom. We're very grateful for all the work you're doing on the technical side, and more importantly, on helping promote and educate the next generation about the Holocaust. This annual lecture was started in memory of Mrs. Jeremias as an annual lecture to coincide with Kristallnacht, and is dedicated to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust in general and the events of Kristallnacht in particular. Mrs. Jeremias, as she reminded me and taught me about the experiences firsthand of what it was as a little girl to experience this infamous November night that would irrevocably change her life and the lives of so many Jews, and really the fate of European Jewry. And she dedicated her life to telling the story to the next generation, to teaching her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, and so many others that were blessed to be adopted into her family, teaching about inspiration, about peace and tolerance, about the will to go on, resilience, and standing up in the face of evil. And we are honored that this is our third lecture since we've instituted this lecture. We're proud now to have them all on our website. You can visit the Young Israel website and listen to the previous ones. I was actually listening to Dr. Pat's in preparation for today, and we ended saying that we were already working to secure our next speaker. The world has certainly changed since we did that, and we began working already last year to find the speaker. But it's really a credit to the Loews that we continue to recognize, even in the midst of all the craziness that is filling our lives, the importance of coming back to this moment and making sure that we carve out space, although in a very new way, to continuing this commemoration and this tradition. I ask you, obviously, we're on Zoom, to bear with us if there are any technical challenges. I think we'll be able to overcome them. This event is being recorded, and we will be taking questions at the end. If you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat, and we will try to address them at the end of the program. It is my pleasure and honor to invite Helen to speak for a little and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good afternoon or evening, and thank you all for participating. It's hard to believe that my mother has been gone for over 2.5 years. I hear her voice in my head all the time. This event is such a suitable tribute to her, and Les and I are honored to sponsor it. Once again, I thank Rabbi Brander for coming up with this appropriate way to remember her, and of course, for all his hard work in organizing the lecture. He had a special relationship with my mother, and I think she changed forever how he thinks about the events of Kristallnacht. Many thanks as well to Kathy Fishman and Voices of Hope, our co-sponsors. My mother's involvement in this organization was very meaningful to her. She believed in its mission and received much encouragement and support from the many people involved. My mother spoke of her Holocaust experiences to many groups. For her, the events of Kristallnacht were a turning point of the war. She was 12 years old. On the long train ride to and from her Jewish school in a distant city, she heard the sound of breaking glass and screaming. She witnessed the bonfire where Torahs, Sidurim, and Talitot were burned. When she made it back home, she saw her father and other Jewish men arrested. Her father was gone for 5 weeks, and during that period, she could not eat, sleep, or function. She lived with constant fear. Her mother declared November 9th a personal fast day. Of course, things got steadily worse after that, and my grandparents perished in Auschwitz. Unfortunately, this year we cannot meet in person. However, Zoom has opened up this event to people who could not physically be here in the past. I am particularly pleased that my sister Paulette, my Aunt Inga, and my mother's grandchildren and great-grandchildren have the opportunity to participate. I am so glad to be able to share my mom's message. It was not easy for her to speak about her experiences, but she felt it was of the utmost importance to relate eyewitness testimony. Her message was one of vigilance, but also one of hope and tolerance. With hate crimes on the rise, it is important and timely reminder to all. Our speaker today is Dr. Efraim Zuroff. Well known for his role in bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, he was the first director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. He then worked for the US Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations to do research in Israel. Presently, he is the director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Israel office and Eastern European Affairs. His efforts have led to legal action against accused Nazis worldwide. Dr. Zuroff has also had a major role in canceling the rehabilitation granted to individuals who participated in the murder of Jews during the Holocaust. He was instrumental as well in identifying Nazi criminals who were receiving disability pensions from Germany, resulting in the cancellation of many of them. Dr. Zuroff is the author of 4 books, and his activities were the subject of 5 television documentaries. A recipient of many honors, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. A historian, scholar, and a Nazi hunter, he has successfully not only brought many Nazis to justice, but kept the importance of pursuing these criminals alive. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Efraim Zuroff.
Thank you very much, Helen. And thank you to the family for sponsoring this important event, which I'm sure means so much to you and to all the people in the community. This lecture is basically an attempt to answer 3 questions that I'm very often asked. One is, are you still hunting Nazis? 2 is, how did you become a Nazi hunter? And 3 is, what do you do as a Nazi hunter? Now, it's very interesting because often after I deliver a speech or a lecture about this subject, people will come up to me and tell me that I have their dream job. And often now it's already grandchildren of survivors. And in the past, it was children of survivors. And they tell me how they grew up wanting to be Nazi hunters and to do whatever they could to catch those Nazis and, of course, do horrible things to them. But the irony of the story is really that that was not my fantasy growing up in Brooklyn. My fantasy actually was to try and be the first Orthodox Jew to play in the NBA. But first of all, to be perfectly honest, I was nowhere near good enough to play in the NBA. And of course, you can't be an Orthodox Jew and play in the NBA. So basketball's loss was Nazi hunting's gain. In any event, I'm going to tell you, talk to you today about 3 cases. And I want to begin with a case that really changed things for me and in a sense turned me from a graduate student studying the Holocaust into a Nazi hunter. It's the case of Joseph Mengele, the infamous angel of death, the doctor who performed the horrible pseudo-scientific experiments in the Auschwitz concentration camp. One of the 23 doctors who performed the selections, deciding who would be sent immediately to be gassed and who would be sent to work. But he was most notorious for his experiments on twins and on other women in order to see if he could create a situation in which all the Aryan children born in Germany would have Aryan racial characteristics. In other words, blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, if you've ever seen a photograph of Dr. Mengele, you know that he had brown hair and brown eyes. But in any event, he was, of course, notorious for these horrible experiments and his role in Auschwitz. And for many years, he had disappeared. He hadn't been found. And in 1985, the Simon Wiesenthal Center sent a request to the National Archives in the United States for any and all documents concerning the case of Dr. Joseph Mengele. And among the documents that they received was a very surprising letter written by a US counterintelligence corps officer to his superior, in which he informed him that he had been told by an informant that the American army had arrested and released Dr. Joseph Mengele near Vienna in late 1946. Now, the letter was dated January 47, and the point was this. The letter seemed absolutely impossible. The United States had arrested Mengele, and not only had they arrested him, they actually let him go, and this sounded really crazy, but the Attorney General of the United States, William French Smith, this is 1985, made three decisions. The first was for the United States of America to join the search for Joseph Mengele. In other words, no one knew where he was. He had simply disappeared into thin air. Two was to determine whether Joseph Mengele had ever entered the United States, because by this point in time, the American authorities were well aware of the fact that thousands of Nazi war criminals had been admitted to the United States posing as innocent refugees. And the third decision was to have a historical commission, have an historical investigation to determine whether or not this information was actually true. Now, I was working for the Office of Special Investigations of the US Justice Department Criminal Division as a researcher in Israel. Now, that was the office that was set up in 1979 to take legal action against the Nazi war criminals living in the United States. And they've done a really remarkable job, I have to say. They've won cases against, I think it's 111 Nazi perpetrators, far more than any other country, actually far more than all the other countries combined. But having said that, there is one thing that you will have to know, which is that in the United States, you cannot prosecute Nazi war criminals for the crimes that they committed, because the crimes were committed overseas and the victims were not Americans. And if the government would have wanted to change that, they would have had to get the approval of 2/3 of the states of the Union, which they were afraid would take an enormous amount of time. And of course, already at that point, time was running out on those more elderly Nazi war criminals. It's something that the problem that we faced since the very beginning. So they decided to opt for what I call the Al Capone compromise. You all know what happened to Al Capone, right? They wanted to nail him for murder, for racketeering and murder. In the end, they nailed him for income tax evasion. So this is something similar. Many of the cases, the people were actually prosecuted for immigration and naturalization violations. When they emigrated to the United States, they were asked specific questions, which if answered honestly, would have barred their entry. In other words, they were asked to list all the places they were before coming to the United States, all their professions. Did you ever fight against the Allies? Did you ever, were you ever part of a movement that persecuted people because of their religion or their ethnic origin, etc.? So they were asked these questions. They lied. At that point, there was very little knowledge of what had happened behind the Iron Curtain. And keep in mind one interesting fact: 98% of the Nazi war criminals who entered the United States were not Germans and Austrians. They were Eastern Europeans, some of the worst of Hitler's henchmen. In any event, our office was given the assignment. The assignment that I received was to try and find the informant. Now, what we knew was that his name was David Freiman. He was a survivor from the Lodz ghetto, among the last Jews deported to Auschwitz in September of 1944. But how do you find him? This is already 1986. It's 41 years after the end of the war. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So I did most of my work at Yad Vashem in those days. And a friend of mine who works there, actually still works there, David Zilberklang, who happened also to be a student of my father's, who is the principal of BTA, if any of you were wondering. He suggested that I look in something called the files of the International Tracing Service. Now, in recent years, this information has become accessible, and it's become more well-known. It's basically an enormous collection of information about people who were in Europe during World War II. And it's based on the requests and questions that millions of people all over the world asked the Red Cross after the war. In other words, people wanted to know where their relatives are, where their friends were. And the Red Cross was the address. And any person about whom it was inquired was in this file. And any person who wanted privileges as a refugee had to register with the International Red Cross, and their name is in this file. Now, in those days, there were no databases. So this was a collection of over 16 million index cards, which were arranged, which was on microfilms, more than 3,600 microfilms. So the first thing to do is to go to the file and check. Now, for some reason, I thought that all the material here had to do with Jews. In other words, the main victims of the Holocaust, obviously. But as I started wading through this material, I realized that most of the people here were non-Jews. Now, what's interesting is that this was not organized according to a regular alphabet. It was organized according to a phonetic alphabet, which meant the following. Double letters count as one. V and W count as the same letter. I, J, and Y count as the same letter. So obviously it took a while to get the hang of it, but I discovered an amazing thing. Now, and that was that even though there was no indication that any of these people were Nazi war criminals, what these index cards included was the emigration destinations of thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of these refugees. Now, I knew from my experience researching for the Justice Department that all the Nazi war criminals, or virtually all the Nazi war criminals who came to the United States, but also those who went to other Anglo-Saxon countries, had all registered as refugees to get benefits as refugees. So in other words, in theory, I could find the emigration destination of thousands of Nazi war criminals in a matter of, not in a matter of minutes, but if I was looking for a specific person, I could find it in a matter of minutes. Now, this seemed almost too good to be true. So I made an experiment. I took the names of 50 Lithuanians and Latvians whom I knew were Nazi war criminals, and I went looking for them in these files. And within a matter of minutes, virtually, I was able to find the immigration destinations of 1/3 of them, about 16, I think it was 49, 16 out of the 49. Most of them went to the United States, some went to Canada, went to Australia, one remained in Germany. Now, this was very, very important because at this point in time, of all the Anglo-Saxon countries which had admitted Nazi war criminals, only the United States had already made a decision to take legal action against them. Canada was investigating. In other words, they understood there was a problem. Australia was investigating. UK, United Kingdom, and New Zealand, in theory, had no idea that they had a problem. As a matter of fact, the only Anglo-Saxon country, major Anglo-Saxon country, that did not admit many, many Nazi war criminals was actually South Africa, because South Africa was closed to immigration, to all immigration. That's why there are hardly any survivors in South Africa, and there were also hardly any Nazi war criminals. What's ironic is that the criminals went to the same countries as the survivors, with the exception of Israel. In any event, I realized that this could make a real difference and help convince these governments to take legal action. So I couldn't do that working for the Americans. So I contacted my old boss in Los Angeles, Rabbi Haya, and I suggested to him that we open an office in Jerusalem and we will start flooding these countries with the names of hundreds of suspects to create a situation in which they cannot refuse to take action against these Nazi war criminals. And thank God that's exactly what happened. Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, Great Britain in 1991, all passed special laws to enable the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, criminal prosecution of Nazi war criminals in those countries. Now, if you're wondering about what happened to Mengele, so as soon as the Americans started looking for him, Israel joined in, Germany renewed its efforts to find him, and they finally carried out a search in the offices of a man named Hans Seidelmeyer. Hans Seidelmeyer was a key official in he was a lawyer and a key person in the Mengele company. The Mengele family had a very large and successful company to produce agricultural machinery. And there they discovered the correspondence between Joseph Mengele and his family. And they discovered, to their great chagrin, of course, that Joseph Mengele had died of a stroke while swimming in the Atlantic Ocean near Sao Paulo on February 7th, 1979, and was buried in a grave in a place called Embu, E-M-B-U, near Sao Paulo. Now, of course, at first there was some doubts as to whether or not this was actually the truth, but the best forensic means of identification were immediately put to use, DNA, teeth, etc., and the conclusion, 99.9% certain, was indeed the man who had been buried under the name Helmut Greger was indeed Dr. Joseph Mengele. And the only consoling thing I can tell you is if you read the correspondence between Mengele and his family, you see that he was very, very distraught, very unhappy, very, very angry that his family wasn't sending him enough money, that he had to hide, that he was afraid that Israel would come and kidnap him like they kidnapped Eichmann. And he basically lived a miserable life. Not that that's, not that that can in any way make up for all his crimes, but at least he didn't live, a very comfortable life. He didn't live a pleasant life. And he died miserable, thank God. Now, basically, that's what sort of catapulted me into worldwide Nazi hunting. And now I want to turn to a very important case, probably the case of the most important Nazi that I helped bring to justice, a man by the name of Dinko Šakić, whom you probably have not heard of because he committed his crimes not in Poland or in Germany. He committed his crimes in Croatia. So first of all, a little background history. The Germans and the Italians invaded Yugoslavia in April of 1941, and they very quickly conquered the country, then started dividing it up into certain little pieces. And one of those pieces was what they called the independent state of Croatia. And this area, which consisted of what's today Croatia, plus Bosnia-Herzegovina and a small piece of Serbia, was turned over to a fascist movement called the Ustasha. I don't know if any of you have heard of them, but they were notoriously anti-Serb, anti-Semitic, hated the Roma, and were a bunch of terrorists, basically. It was founded in 1920 in the hope of separating Croatia from Yugoslavia. And when the Nazis came to power, when the Nazis occupied Yugoslavia, they basically turned the country over to them. And on the one hand, they were very happy to be able to get control of the country. On the other hand, the problem that they faced was that the territory that they were given was full of the minorities that they hated. Hundreds of thousands of Serbs, 40,000 Jews, thousands of Roma, and of course, their political opponents. So from the very beginning, already in April of 1941, they set up Jasenovac and many other concentration camps, to which all the people I mentioned, all the groups that I mentioned, thousands and thousands of these people were sent, deported to Jasenovac and the other concentration camps, where hundreds of thousands of them were murdered. In Jasenovac alone, I think, a minimum of 100,000 people, mostly Serbs, 18,000 Jews, thousands of gypsies, and thousands of their political opponents. And this camp was notorious for the cruelty of the guards, for the horrors that the tortures that they tortured the inmates. They even, I'll give you one little example. They invented, in quotation marks, a special dagger, which, if when used, would make the murder more painful for the victim than normal. And they called this dagger a Serb killer. In any event, horrible, horrible, horrible place. But unfortunately, many of the people, many of these Ustasha were able to escape after World War II because of an escape network set up by an Austrian bishop by the name of Alois Hudal, Hudal. Now, Alois Hudal's deputy was an Ustasha priest by the name of Kronislav Dragonovich. So it's not surprising that many Ustasha were able to escape. Now, these people basically crossed the Alps from Germany and Austria into Italy, and they had safe houses prepared all along the way. The people who helped them with priests, Catholic priests, and they ultimately got to Genoa in Italy on the Italian Riviera. And there, they were given false passports, and they had a choice. They could go either to the Middle East, that was either Egypt or Syria, or to South America, primarily to Argentina, but not only there. Brazil admitted many Nazi war criminals, Chile, Paraguay, and what else? Chile, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. In any event, that's why one of the biggest mass murderers of World War II, a man named Ante Pavelic, who was the head of state of Croatia, ran away to Buenos Aires. Dinko Šakić ran away to Santa Teresita, south of Buenos Aires, and we were able to track him down with the help of an Argentinian journalist named Jorge Camarasa. Now, before we sent Camarasa to confront Šakić with the TV crew, we sent him to Yugoslavia, to Serbia actually, to meet with survivors of Jasenovac. And they described to him in graphic detail the horrors of the camp, the terror, the executions. And I mean, the camp was really a nightmare to be there. And then they went to then Camarasa went with the TV crew to knock on Šakić's door. Okay, knock on the door, Šakić comes to the door. Are you Dinko Šakić? He says, yes. You were the commandant of Jasenovac. He says, yes. So let's stop there for a minute. Normally, when a Nazi war criminal is exposed or about to be exposed, there's two answers. One is, it's a mistaken identity. It's not me. The second one is, it's me, but I didn't do it. What does Dinko Šakić say? He says, it's me and I did it. Now, this is not happening right after the war. 50 years have passed already. Šakić had plenty of time to think about it. But that's what he says. So Camarasa asked him if he could ask him a few questions. Can he come in? They sit in Šakić's living room, and Camarasa says to him, listen, you were the commandant of the worst camp in Croatia. In fact, the worst camp in the Balkans. Jasenovac was nicknamed the Auschwitz of the Balkans. What do you have to say for yourself? She says, Šakić says, what's the problem? Jasenovac was a penal colony. Every country has penal colonies, and every person who was in Jasenovac deserved to be there. So Camarasa says, listen, buddy, not buddy, he says, listen, you can't fool me. I just came from speaking to the survivors of Jasenovac. And I know about the incredible death rate. I know about the horrible epidemics. I know about the people murdered for breach of discipline and all that. So Šakić says to him, you just don't get it. Mortality was usual, no big epidemics of typhus. But you know what the problem with Jasenovac was? The problem was they didn't let us finish the job. You know what that means? Kill all the Serbs, all the Jews, all the Roma, and all their political opponents. That would be finishing the job. Anyway, we had big dilemma what to do with this Shakic. In other words, where should he be put on trial? In theory, there were like 6 different countries where he might have been tried, starting with Argentina, where he lived, Germany, even though Germany, by the way, there was not a single Nazi in Jasenovac, a single German or Austrian. Every single crime was committed by the Ustasha, by the Croatian fascists. It could have been Israel, 18,000 Jews murdered there, or the 3 countries were part of Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia. Now, the camp itself was in Croatia and Bosnia. And if we were only thinking in terms of result, we would have sent him to Serbia, because I say half facetiously that within 5 minutes of being convicted, he would be hanging from the highest tree in Belgrade. That's the capital of Serbia. Why? Because the Serbs were the main victims. And there was no doubt that he would be convicted and no doubt that he would be hung. But the question that we asked ourselves was, who needs the lesson of Jasenovac the most? In Serbia, everyone knows about Jasenovac. So many people lost relatives there. They lost family, friends. It's in the curriculum. It's no secret. But where do they need this lesson? They need it in Croatia, a country where at least half the country thinks that the Ustashas were good guys. They were patriots. But there's a problem. The president of Croatia at this time, a man named Franjo Tuđman, actually had denied the Holocaust. And he considered himself a historian. He wrote a book in which he said that the Jews inflated the number of victims in Jasenovac from 1 million to 6, not in Jasenovac, the victims in the Shoah, from 1 million to 6 million. And it was the Jews who ran the camp, which was, I mean, it was totally false, absurd, actually. And the irony of the story was that Tuđman himself had fought with Tito's partisans. His brother had been murdered by the Ustasha. But when he became a politician in post-communist Croatia, he became an ultra-nationalist. But we gambled. It was really a gamble. We opted for Croatia. And they extradited him and put him on trial. And I'm happy to say they did it. It was done very well. It was given enormous publicity. The sessions were on TV in many cases. Every single day, the results of the proceedings were broadcast, and it really had an effect. There's no question. In other words, it really had a very important and positive impact on Croatian society. So I want to give you a few glimpses of the trial. So probably the most dramatic testimony was of a man then of 85 years old, who as a young teenager had been taken from his home in Sarajevo together with other young Jewish men, young Jewish boys, teenagers basically, and had been brought to Jasenovac, deported to Jasenovac. And a few days after their arrival in the camp, they were taken by the guards and given the following assignment. The guards had murdered quite a few inmates, and after murdering them, they had hacked off their arms and their legs, and they made a large pile of body parts at the edge of the camp, right near the Sava River. The Sava River flowed at the edge of Jasenovac. And they took these kids and they said to them, your task now is to throw these body parts into the Sava River. So Yaakov Finzi turned around to the guard who gave the order, and he said to him, why are you doing this to us? So the guard said to him, because you murdered Jesus. He knew he was a Jew. So how do you get a Jasenovac? You get a Jasenovac with hundreds of years of Christian anti-Semitism, the fascism of the Ustasha, and the racism of the Nazis. That's how you get a Jasenovac. Now, the good news is that Shakic was convicted. By the way, he wasn't tried for genocide. That was a political decision. But in any event, he was convicted. He was given the maximum sentence of 20 years in jail. Now, on the day of the verdict, this was crazy. I mean, the courtroom was packed, absolutely packed. But the problem was that half the people in the courtroom were in favor of Shakic. And just to give you a little sample of what happened during the trial. So one day after the proceedings had ended, The judge, Drazen Tripolo, who did a terrific job, was in the corner in a very animated conversation with someone, and two policemen were taking Shakic out of the room. And he happened to notice that some of his supporters were there. So he looked at them and smiled at them, and what was their response? The Ustasha salute, which is exactly like the Sieg Heil, the Nazis. But no one saw it except for us. Anyway, that's just to give you an idea of the, you know what? I'll tell you another thing to give you an idea of what we were up against. The World Cup in 1998 was held in France. That's the soccer championship of the world. And on the Saturday night, July 4th, there was a quarterfinals match between little Croatia, it had a population of 5 million, and Germany, 82 million, and the best soccer team in the world. And the Croatians upset the Germans 3-0. And it was the biggest upset in World Cup history. Now, during the first half, I was walking on my way to the hotel to see the game, and all of a sudden, I felt that the earth was shaking. So I asked someone, what's going on? Is there an earthquake? He said, no, Croatia scored a goal against Germany in the match. Later on, when the match was over, I went out to see the celebrations, and within 5 minutes, I see marching towards me 7 young men in their 20s. And they're waving some flag. I couldn't see if it was an Ustasha flag or a Croatian flag. They're quite similar. And they're yelling at the top of their lungs, Dinko Shakic, Dinko Shakic. Dinko Shakic is in jail awaiting trial for mass murder. He didn't score the goals for Croatia against Germany, right? Why are they yelling his name? Because for many Croatians, Dinko Shakic is a hero. Why is he a hero? Because in their minds, he knew how to deal with Croatia's enemies, the horrible Serbs, the disgusting Jews, disgusting Roma, etc. In any event, the good news is that he was convicted and he died in jail. But I want to leave you with one anecdote about that same day of the verdict, because it stays with me to this day, and it'll always stay with me. As I was leaving the hall of the trial, and there were a lot of nasty comments. One guy said to me, "Why don't you go back to Israel and deal with the Palestinians?" He said it in very good American English, by the way. In any event, someone stopped me on the way, tall, very distinguished looking, well-dressed gentleman. He says to me, "Listen, I have only one word to say to you." What's the word? Hvala. Hvala in Croatian, Serbo-Croatian means thank you. If not for you, the trial would not have taken place. Now, I had no idea who he was. So I asked someone, who was this gentleman? And then the story came out. The story is the following. One day in April 1944, there was a breach of discipline in the camp when Shakic was commandant. And he ordered all the inmates to appear in the central square of the camp, and they had to line up. Appel, it's called, an appel, a call. And anyway, he's walking up and down the rows of the inmates and totally at random picking out people who are going to be hung in reprisal for the breach of discipline. And one of the people he pulled out of the line was a doctor from Montenegro, a non-Jew, by the name of Dr. Miller Bošković. And when he was pulled out of the line by Shakic, he said to Shakic, "Listen, I'm from Montenegro, and my tradition doesn't allow me to be hung." On the spot, Shakic takes out his pistol, shoots him in the head 3 times, and murders him. The person who stopped me was his brother, who I can promise you never dreamt in a million years that Croatia would be independent, would become a democracy, and that democracy would put the super patriot Dinko Shakic on trial and convict him and send him away for the rest of his life. And it doesn't get better than that, I'm telling you. So one of the things Simon Wiesenthal always emphasized, Simon Wiesenthal is the most famous Nazi hunter, in a sense, our mentor. He always stressed the importance of giving the families and victims closure and letting them feel that at least justice was served and the people who turned their loved ones into victims simply because they were, in this case, in Croatia, Jews, Serbs, or Roma, or anti-fascists, but most of the places Jews, right? That's why they were murdered. So I have a very frustrating job. You have no idea how many people die on me in the middle of investigations or before trials, or we lose cases because of all sorts of problems. And it's very, I have to say, when you invest something like 5 years in a case, and all of a sudden the guy is acquitted in a totally outrageous decision, it takes a toll. But what I take with me is that no matter what frustration I feel, by the way, I'm the only Jew in the world who prays for the good health of Nazi war criminals. You understand that? I need them alive so that we can bring them to justice, right? So whatever I'm feeling, and you know what I mean? I mean, I've cried plenty of tears, believe me, when we lost cases or when we weren't able to bring someone to the very end of the process and have him punished the way he should be. Whatever frustrations we face in this struggle, they're nothing compared to what the victims went through and what those who survived went through. It's much, much worse. They're the real victims. They're the people who really suffered. And we have to, chin up and continue the fight as we're doing. So the last story I'm going to tell you is about an investigation that is ongoing as we speak. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know the details of the mass murder of the Jews of Lithuania. Lithuania had the highest percentage of victims among the large Jewish communities. 96.4% of the 220,000 Jews who lived in Lithuania under the Nazi occupation were murdered. And the Lithuanians also murdered 20,000 Jews in Belarus. In other words, the Lithuanians were so good at what they did, the Nazis exported them to Belarus to kill Jews in Belarus. And there were also Jews brought from Germany, Austria, and France to be murdered in Lithuania. So in all, about almost a quarter of a million Jews were murdered in Lithuania. Now, 90% of those Jews were murdered by shooting near their homes, usually within a half an hour of their homes in a forest. And only 10% were later deported. Survivors of the large ghettos were sent to different either concentration camps, either in Estonia, Latvia, Stutthof in Poland, and later to Dachau and other places. Now, one of the amazing facts about the history of the Shoah in Lithuania is that there were only 1,000, actually less than 1,000 Germans stationed in Lithuania. Now, keep in mind, all the Jews murdered in Lithuania were murdered by shooting. In other words, every single one had to be murdered individually. That's incredibly labor intensive. And because there were so few Germans, they needed a lot of help, and they got a lot of zealous helpers among the Lithuanians. In any event, a survivor of the Kovna ghetto, Leib Kunachowski, spent 4 years after the war collecting testimony of the Jews in the provincial towns. Almost all of the survivors from Lithuania are from the big ghettos, from Vilna, Kovna, Shavli, Ponevezh. Almost no survivors from the little places. And that's why Leib Kunachowski wanted to make sure he would record the testimony of the few survivors from those places. He spent 4 years doing it, initially in Lithuania and later in Germany in the displaced persons camps. And he had a collection. He had collected 171 testimonies, 1,684 pages of testimony in Yiddish. And what he did was he focused very strongly on the identity of the local killers. And you have to keep in mind that in practically all the cases in the provincial towns, the killers were the neighbors. So in other words, the survivors knew who they were. And we made a list. As soon as it took us 41 years to get our hands on this material, because he wanted the book, he wanted this collection published as a book. And in the 70s and 80s, and till late 80, till 89, no one was willing to publish it. And finally, Professor Dov Levine, the biggest expert on the Baltics, finally convinced him to turn it over to Yad Vashem. As soon as he got to Yad Vashem, he sat down with my father, whose Mama Lashon is Yiddish, and we compiled a list of 1,284 perpetrators in Lithuania, of whom only 121 were known to us, because we had many lists of Lithuanian and Nazi war criminals, collaborators, but most of the 90% of these names were brand new. So what do you do? What do you do with these names? You go to the International Tracing Service to try and find out, maybe some of these people ran away to America, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, or New Zealand. In any event, one of the most shocking testimonies was the testimony of a woman by the name of Dina Flam. And I want to quote two sentences from that testimony. She said as follows: she was hiding near a barn, and she was hiding in a pile of hay. Okay, so she said like this. She wrote the following, or she said the following, which was recorded by Kunachowski. While I was hiding in the hay, I saw very clearly two women standing at the pit who were smashing the heads of Jewish babies with a large rock, or smashing the heads together, in other words, killing two by smashing their heads together. One of them was the student Klemaita. That's what it said. Okay, so what does this tell us? This tells us that a young woman, there are two women who are murdering Jewish babies in the most horrific way imaginable. One of them is identified as a student by the name Klemaita. The name Klemaita indicates that she's single. In other words, the last names of women in Lithuania indicate their marital status. Klemaita means she's not married yet, but she's from the Klimas family, and that's what we know. Now, I went to the files to look for the women by that name, and I found two women, two sisters, one born in 1923, one born in 1925. Now, that means that in theory, they could have been the one, they actually could have been two, they could have been both. They could have been two sisters, because one was 18 years old, 1941, when the murders took place in this town called Rasein, in the middle of Lithuania. She would have been a university student. Her sister was 16 or 16 and a half. She could have been a gymnasium or a high school student. And it turns out that these two sisters ran away to Canada. And I submitted the names of these people to the Canadian authorities, but because we didn't know the first name of the killer, or any of the name of the second killer, apparently the Canadian authorities didn't do anything. Now, about 7 months ago, we started a project in Canada to identify Ukrainian Waffen-SS who were still living in Canada and getting German pensions. And we found a very ingenious way to find them, actually. This is my researcher, Abby Korb, came up with this. The Ukrainian veterans, SS veterans, like to be buried together in the same cemetery. So they bought cemetery plots. And what happens is this: when one of a couple, either the male, in other words, the husband or the wife pass away, they set up a monument with space for both names. So in other words, if you come by a monument with the name of the wife, that means the husband is still alive. Okay, his name is listed, but there's no information because he hasn't died yet. So that's why we're finding all of these people, which we're going to expose in another couple of probably 2 or 3 months. But in the meantime, my researcher was able to find one of the sisters named Klemaita. And guess what? She's still alive. And she's 97 years old, and she's living in Windsor, Canada. And she's living by herself, which is wonderful, because that means she's okay. In other words, she could be exposed. But the problem now is that we have to find the name of the killer. So I wrote a post on Facebook that I am urgently looking for people who have connections to the town called Rasein, or Rasenai in Lithuanian, where these murders took place. And I figured out that the best thing to do is to be able to send someone to Rasein to interview the elderly people there who could tell us what the name of the student was. But what complicated matters was that Rasein is actually the COVID-19 capital of Lithuania, has the highest percentage of COVID cases. Nice place, they probably deserve it. But in any event, so no one wants to go there. So someone suggested a journalist who I actually knew, who was the son of a Jew and someone who was involved in Holocaust remembrance. And I wrote to him, I called him up and I asked him, is he willing to try and figure this out for us, to help us out and try and find the name? So, but I warned him, I said, listen, whatever you do, don't go to the municipal archives in Rasein looking for information. Now, why did I say that? Because there's an Israeli graduate student who wrote an MA about the Rasein district during the Shoah. And before the pandemic started, she visited Rasein and went to the archives because she's now got permission to expand her MA into a doctorate. And the minute she started talking about local perpetrators to the woman who's the expert on the Jewish history in Rasein, she gave her the cold shoulder. She didn't want to help her. Now, you understand what's going on. In other words, she's like a nationalist, a right-winger Lithuanian. So in any event, I told this guy, Mr. Bunker, whatever you do, don't go to that woman, number one, and don't tell anybody that I'm involved in this search, because I'm like the most hated Jew in Lithuania, okay? Because I tried very hard to get them to prosecute Nazi war criminals. So what does he do? He sends this woman an email, and he forgot to erase my email. So she got his email with my email. Okay, next thing I know, the next day, a email is waiting for me, which has been posted on Facebook. It says the following: there were no female murderers in Rasein. Anyone who says that this is a legend. Anyone who tells this story is trying to divide between Lithuanians and Jews. Now, I hope you all are following what's going on here, okay? So I really lost my temper a little bit, and I said to her, listen, this is the truth. You can't take the truth, and the sooner you start telling the truth about the Shoah, you'll be able to get out from under the shadow of the Shoah. So she got really angry, and she started, she started threatening me, etc. Anyway, next thing I know, the Israeli graduate student sends me a PDF of the book that this woman wrote on the Jews of Rasein. It's actually quite nice, very nice book. And I'm looking at the material on the Holocaust, and what do I see all of a sudden? There's a testimony of the same woman whose testimony I read to you, Dina Flam, only it's a different testimony, which is published in this lady's book. So I write to her, I have news for you. I got the information about the baby murderer from the same exact person whose testimony you published in the book that you wrote about the Jews of Rasein. So she goes, I'm going to have to go talk to the elderly people. Now, the question is, first of all, can we trust her? We don't know. So we're, of course, trying to get some other people to go there and find the name. Now, my dream right now is that lady is indeed the murderer. And think what a message it sends when we expose her. You murdered Jewish babies. 79 years later, we'll come after you to expose you, ruin your life, and try and get you brought to justice. I think that's a very important lesson. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zuroff, and thank you to the extended Loew Jeremias family. If you want to, you can send your questions in the chat. If you have any questions, please send them our way. We got a couple questions while you were speaking. If you're okay, if we can take some questions, and please, people, if you have any questions, please send it in the chat. Or if you want, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. I think you sort of answered this question, but maybe more generally, If you could share with us, what is the next, 5 years of Nazi hunting look like as both survivors and primary sources, and obviously the people who you're seeking seem to be aging even more?
Okay, they are aging, as we all are, frankly. And we're approaching the end of this issue. But first of all, you have to understand two things. One is that the life expectancy has been extended considerably, and that's why there are still people alive who committed the crimes of the Shoah. For example, there was just a conviction of a guard from the Stutthof camp, that's near Gdansk in Poland, the first camp built outside the Third Reich, where 65,000 people were murdered, 28,000 Jews. And this guy was a guard, and he was put on trial at age 93, and he was convicted for his service in the camp. Now, that's one thing. Second thing is that Germany changed its prosecution policy in a very dramatic way. For several decades, in order to prosecute a Nazi war criminal in Germany, you had to prove that that person had committed a specific crime against a specific victim, with knowing the name even, and had done so motivated by racial hatred. It's almost impossible to prove. Now, actually, because of the Demjanjuk case, they changed the policy to be able to prosecute any person who served in a death camp or a camp with the apparatus for mass annihilation, gas chamber, or gas vans, can be prosecuted based on service alone without having to prove that they were involved in a single physical act of persecution. That's how, for example, Oscar Groening, the accountant of Auschwitz, was convicted. So that's been a godsend, I have to say, to be honest. That has really given us another lease on life. And there, I think, at least 14 investigations going on right now in Germany. Germany and the United States are actually the only countries that are really actively looking for them. But in the United States, they ran out of suspects. Although just last week, last week, a deportation order was confirmed for Karl Friedrich Berger, who lived in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and was a guard in Neuengamme, and hopefully he'll be shipped out of the state soon. But listen, one of the things I have to explain is that increasingly over the last years, I've been devoting time to the fight against Holocaust distortion. And my latest book, which is called Our People, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Holocaust, is an example of what we're trying to do to educate Lithuanian society. So this book is actually quite unique because it was written with a non-Jewish Lithuanian author who was one of the most popular authors in Lithuania and who discovered several years ago that her family had been involved in killing Jews. So I'm a descendant of the victims. I'm actually named for one of the Jews killed in Lithuania. She's a descendant of the murderers. We went on a mission to 40 places of mass murder where Lithuanians murdered Jews, including 5 places in Belarus, by the way. What I told you, this Lithuanian unit was sent there to murder Jews. And we went to see if you could find the places. Are they marked? Are they tended to? We interviewed eyewitnesses. You know, I'll tell you one story, which to my mind is incredibly symbolic and characteristic. In a town called Schwencionelli, Novo Schwencian in Yiddish, I saw an old lady coming out of a grocery store. And I said to Ruta, no, listen, she looks like the right age. Ask her if she remembers anything from the war. Okay, she goes over to her. She starts telling us the story. Yes, she remembers the war. She was about 8 years old in 1941 because a large percentage of the Jews of Lithuania were murdered in 1941 already, after the invasion in June. And they were friendly. Her family was friendly with the Jewish family. Both families had 2 girls. They had an older girl, and she was 8 years old, and she was friendly with the younger girl. And when the measures started against the Jews, there was a very intense conversation in her home about whether they could save her young Jewish friend. So I said to her, through Ruta, Ruta Vanagaita is the co-author. I said to her, well, you probably were afraid of the Germans. She said, no, I was afraid of my neighbors. And she started crying. It was heartbreaking in a certain sense. It was as if like a heavy stone rolled off her heart because she was finally able to tell her story to someone who was sympathetic to her, who wanted to say, because she wanted to save Jews. And she's living in an environment where the natural thing was to murder a Jew, and many of her neighbors, that's what they did. So this was an absolutely heartbreaking mission. It took us 40 days, and we didn't do it. It wasn't consecutive because it's simply impossible emotionally. You know, it's like I've been to quite a few of the death camps, and several of them several times. Nothing touched me as profoundly as this procession from mass grave to mass grave, every place to say Kaddish, El Malei Rachamim, and know that right under me were lying the corpses of, in some cases, dozens, in some cases, hundreds, in some cases, thousands of my people. But the good news was that we were able to get this book published in Lithuanian. And the reason it was published in Lithuanian was because Ruta, my co-author, was like the goose that laid the golden eggs. She was her previous book had sold 50,000 copies in a country of less than 2.5 million people. And it was pop psychology. I mean, none of her books had to do with the Shoah until this book. So she wrote a book about women at 50, advice to women at 50 in many places, especially in the towns and villages. Women at 50 in Lithuania feel that their lives are over. The husbands are either disappeared or they're alcoholics or God knows what. And Ruta gave them advice how to take their lives, seize their lives and turn their lives around. And many times I was walking with her on the street in Vilna, people would come up to her and kiss her and say, "You saved my life." And Ruta, of course, had no idea who she was, right? In any event, so when Ruta went to the publisher, they told her, "Listen, you wrote a terrific book about women. Why don't you write a book about men?" So she said, "I'll write a book about men, but first I'm writing another book." "Ah, Ruta, so wonderful. You're already writing another book. What are you writing about?" "I'm writing about the Holocaust." "What are you, nuts? Who's going to buy a book about the Holocaust?" But I'm happy to say that the book was a bestseller in Lithuania, 20,000 copies sold. And we also, by the way, taped our conversations. Half the book is our conversations as we go from place to place, talking about the identity of the killers, the motivation of the killers, the role of anti-Semitism, the role of alienation between Jews. To say in the provinces, the Jews lived in the center of town. They were more educated, a little bit better off in some cases. And the whole periphery was Lithuanian farmers. So there was a lot of interaction between them, but there was no real connection, you could say. Maybe that's part of it. But there's a lot of reasons why the Lithuanians were so anxious to collaborate with the Nazis. One of which was that they assumed that if they helped the Nazis would give them independence. They had been independent from 1918 to 1940. Then the Russians came in for a year, then the Nazis came in, and they, of course, wanted to get their independence back. But of course, what they didn't know was that the Germans had absolutely no intention of giving them independence. In any event, and there was also the financial issue. They wanted to steal the Jews' property, to steal the Jews' belongings. And that's why you had thousands and thousands of Lithuanians from all strata of society actively participating in these murders. And that's what makes it so hard for the Lithuanians to tell the truth. In other words, they have a special day, Holocaust Memorial Day. What do they say? Shoah was a terrible tragedy. Germans came and murdered our Jews. Aye, what about the local helpers? A bunch of degenerates. Few, miscasts, social miscasts, outcasts rather. So our book in Lithuanian, one second, I'll show you. If you look at this cover, you can see two faces. Okay, through the letters of Musishki. Musishki means our guys, our chevra, so to speak, lahavdil. Okay, now if you had to choose if I tell you one is a Jew and the other one is a Nazi collaborator, Lithuanian, you think you could tell the difference? I doubt it. The Jew represented Lithuania over here. The Jew represented Lithuania in 2 Olympics as a cyclist. As Ruta says, good enough to represent us in the Olympics, not good enough to live. Murdered in the Kovna ghetto. This guy, Yimach Shemo v'Zichro, Balas Norvegia, the Lithuanian commander of the special unit that murdered 70,000 Jews in Ponar outside Vilna. So the message that Ruta wanted to send, I mean, this is all Ruta's thing, she's a genius in marketing also, was you in Lithuania, you Lithuanians think that neither the victims, they were communists, they got what they deserved, they exploited us, they deported us to Siberia, nor the murderers, they're a bunch of degenerates. They're not, neither of them are part of Lithuanian society. But the truth is that they're both part of Lithuanian society, both groups, the victims and the murderers. So the book was read by about 100,000 people. You might notice also that my name is not on this book, even though I'm the co-author, because they were convinced that if my name is on the book, no one will buy it. So in the Lithuanian version, it's not there, but in every other version, it's there. It's already been printed in six languages, in Hebrew, Russian, Polish, Swedish, English now, Lithuanian, and Japanese and Ukrainian are also being prepared, and we hope there'll be other languages. But the main message is to the younger people of Lithuania who grew up under the European Union that they must tell the truth about the Shoah. And they'll never be able to get out from under that shadow until they're willing to face the truth. So this is one of the things that we do to combat this Holocaust distortion.
So I'm just going to combine 2 questions for one last question. Has Lithuania accepted responsibility like Germany? And as we've seen in recent years, some of the legislation out of Poland about taking that type of responsibility or not being able to by law, what are your feelings on that?
Okay, first of all, Lithuania was the locomotive that pulled this whole process. And any initiative that was, the initiatives to criminalize all sorts of statements about the Holocaust and about communism. By the way, one of their big goals is to create a false symmetry between communist crimes and Nazi crimes, because it's very important for them to convince Europe that communism was genocide. Now, why is that important? One of the reasons is because if communism is genocide, that means the Jews committed genocide. If Jews committed genocide, how can we complain about the fact that they committed genocide? Or in other words, if everyone is guilty, no one is guilty. So they're working very hard, for example, to get a joint Memorial Day for all the victims of totalitarian regimes. In other words, communism and Nazism. What day do they want it to be on? August 23rd. What happened on August 23rd? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression pact between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. In other words, they want to say, you innocent observer think that the Nazis bear, the Third Reich bears the sole responsibility for World War II. Think again. The Soviets signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, paving the way for the start of World War II. And they're basically equating the country which conceived, planned, built, and ran the biggest mass murder factory in human history, Auschwitz-Birkenau, with a country with all its flaws. I don't want in any way minimize communist crimes, whose army, the Red Army, liberated Auschwitz and stopped the mass murder. So, and of course, I hope you all understand that if this thing is accepted, there won't be any need for International Holocaust Day, because this is a day that relates to more victims, millions more victims, more universal. So it's a very dangerous initiative. And in Lithuania, for example, if I were to walk down Gediminas Avenue and say that communism isn't genocide, I could go to jail for 2 years. And there's a whole bunch of other laws like that, similar to the Polish law. But the Lithuanians were the first ones to do it initially, right? And then the Latvians did it, then the Estonians, then the Poles, etc. So they have an incredibly important role. and we are working very, very hard to combat this thing. And we're having some success, but it's a long uphill battle.
I guess I'll just ask one last question. So two people asked the same question. Have you ever had to cause to be fearful for your safety in your research or on-site investigations?
Unfortunately, I read the internet. I follow the internet. And according to the internet, they've suggested that I be executed quite a few times. But listen, if I lived in one of these countries where I'm so hated, I would really need security. But since I live in Israel, thank God, and I only make forays to these places, to demonstrate against neo-Nazi marches, to try and lobby the government to put people on trial, things of this sort, go to trials. So I'm not in that much danger, I would say. But listen, I've also been sued. I've been sued for libel twice. Once in Scotland, because of a book I wrote about the Nazis living in Britain. Once in Hungary, because I got a gendarmerie officer who was involved in the murder of thousands of Jews, Serbs, and Gypsies. I got him under investigation and he got him indicted. So I've also experienced that.
Thank you. So thank you everyone so much for joining. I'm sorry, I know there are more questions, but the hour is getting late, particularly in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, where Dr. Zuroff is joining us. So we thank you so much for...
Just one last comment, okay? One last comment. First of all, if any of you are interested in following what we do, so there's a website, which is operationlastchance.org. You can follow me on Twitter, capital E, capital Z, UROFF. And the book in English, which just came out several months ago, is called Our People, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Holocaust. Rowan and Littlefield are the publishers. You can find it on the usual outlets, Amazon, etc. And thank you for your listening and your concern and your support. And thank you to all the people in the community who are doing their best to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive and to keep it in mind and to use those memories to increase tolerance, brotherhood, and all the good things that we want to see all over the world.
Amen. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Young Israel, on the extended Jeremias and Loew family, thank you so much for joining us. God willing, next year, put on your calendar, we'll be able to celebrate the 4th annual Kristallnacht Commemoration, Margot Jeremias Memorial Lecture. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that in person in good health and happiness. I wish you everyone a great rest of the day. And I thank you so much for joining us.
Okay.